Tantra Illuminated with Dr. Christopher Wallace is a journey through the depths of the human experience, as viewed through the lens of the tradition called non-dual Shaiva Tantra. This multi-format podcast delves into the fascinating world of Classical Tantra and its intersections with philosophy, neuroscience, psychology, human development, and the broader world of spirituality. This episode is a teaching talk in which I share two of the most important principles in the practice of Classical Tantra. The first of these is the three effective methods. Now, I've spoken about these before, so this version is a short and simple summary of that topic, covering about 30 minutes. Then after that, there's a teaching you won't have heard before on the pure motive. More specifically, on the three aspects of the pure motive and how they antidote ineffective motives for practice. Here, the traditional phrase pure motive really refers to effective motive for practice. And this is something we need to cultivate over time. It can't arrive all at once. As we develop pure motive, it has a huge impact on our practice. Our practice becomes very obviously more and more effective, impactful, and powerful. This talk was originally given for the Tantrik Arts Collective, which is a group founded by students and friends of mine. And thank you to them for making it available now to the wider public. It's such an important teaching. Please watch or listen until the end. So, what I want to focus in on is some of the key insights that this tradition gives us that are still relevant today and are in fact relevant for anyone doing any kind of committed spiritual practice. And this is significant, of course, that some of the most valuable and far-reaching insights of any given spiritual tradition can be applied by practitioners no matter which tradition they're practicing within. So that's what I want to focus on today. And everyone, I think, knows that the goal of spiritual practice in these South Asian traditions is awakening and liberation. And those are not, in fact, two goals, but one goal with two aspects: awakening to our true nature and becoming radically free from delusion, from falsehood, from ego, from conditioning, and so on, and from suffering, of course. So awakening to our true nature makes possible liberation from delusion and mind-created suffering. And there's also a kind of feedback loop between these two aspects of the goal. The more awake we are to our true nature, which of course underlies everything in existence, not just human beings, the more free we can become. And as we shed some of that delusion or falsehood or egoic self-concepts, then we can deepen the awakening and then become even more free. So in this way, there can be a positive feedback loop between those two aspects of the goal. And as I hope you gather from what I'm saying, how I'm describing it, the goal is not, it's not a binary. It's not like you're unawake and then suddenly you're 100% awake. You're unliberated and suddenly you're liberated. Not at all, right? So, I sometimes use the analogy of pregnancy because you're either pregnant or you're not, but you can be more pregnant, a lot more, right? And it can show. People can notice it. And in the same way, it is true that you're either awake or you're not, but that state of awakening, which is not really a state, it's a new context for experience in life. It can deepen and grow and become more and more obvious, and of course, make possible further liberation, further freedom, as I already said. So when people come to understand that this goal of awakening and liberation is possible for them, that it's not just for these ancient masters, it's not just something that the Buddha experienced and a few other famous enlightened people, but it's in fact possible for everyone to one degree or another, right? We don't even have to think about or worry about the idea of being fully awake, fully liberated, like, because for most people to even experience a degree of that awakeness and liberation is more than sufficient for a radical transformation of their experience of life. And in fact, if we look at it sort of scientifically, we simply don't know what are the limits of this process. We don't know if there's such a thing as being as awake or liberated as it's possible to be. But we certainly do have many great historical examples to inspire us. But those historical examples also can work against us because they become over idealized and pedestalized. And then people don't realize, oh, how possible this is for them. It's possible for every human being because this potential for awakening is hardwired into us as humans, you could say. And I'm sure that one day science will prove that that's the case. Cognitive neuroscience, no doubt, will one day prove that that's the case. And I actually know some people working on that exact thing in the field of cognitive neuroscience. It's still a long road to go, but imagine the impact if it becomes common knowledge that all human beings have this potentiality, that we are, as it were, hardwired for this awakening process, whether it ever happens in a given person's life, it at least is possible. So that's a first important insight, which is that this is not something that is the domain of the spiritual experts and the masters, that it's accessible to everyone to one degree or another, and perhaps to an ever deepening degree as well. So once people become aware that this is really possible, then they want to know how. How do I attain? It's really the wrong verb, but people use it all the time. How do I attain this awakening and liberation? What practices will bring it about? And here we immediately run into an interesting fact. Well, I call it a fact. We could say insight from this tradition and several others as well, that spiritual practice cannot, in fact, cause awakening. Or we could also just say awakeness to your true nature. Spiritual practice doesn't cause it. It just helps to make that condition, that mode of being, more and more possible. So we could use an analogy of spiritual practice as like fertilizing the soil and aerating the soil and doing everything necessary to help those seeds sprout. But then, the sprouting of the seed is really a miracle of nature. And anyone who's done any work with plants or gardening, sometimes all the conditions are right and a seed just doesn't sprout. And other times the conditions are not quite right and the seed sprouts. It's not perfectly predictable, but we can make it more and more likely that those seeds sprout. And so that's essentially what spiritual practice is. So that's why I think it was Trungpa who said, enlightenment is an accident, but practice makes you accident prone. And that's just a good way to remember this principle. It's, not perfectly stated, but it's a memorable quote. So that we understand that the practices don't cause the state. And therefore, we're barking up the wrong tree when we are looking for the perfect practice, the magic bullet that's just going to then accomplish everything that we want to accomplish. So the attitude to practice advocated by the tradition is quite important, right? And we see different attitudes in different traditions. And there's a big contrast in the history of South Asian religions between Tantra and Hatha Yoga, for example, even though many practices of Hatha Yoga came out of Tantra, even though we could say Hatha Yoga is based in Tantra, still it's fundamentally different, which is to say Hatha Yoga advocates striving really hard, the yoga of force or of striving, Hatha Yoga. Whereas Tantra was often, by contrast, called the Sahaja Yoga, the natural or spontaneous yoga. So this is a fundamentally different, irreconcilable orientation. Is practice to be done in this hardcore, striving, no pain, no gain way, or is it to be done with this sweet, gentle, yet persistent effort, persistently showing up and yet holding everything lightly, holding the concepts of the tradition themselves lightly, because otherwise they become dogmas, they become rigid doctrines. Holding the practices lightly, meaning doing them assiduously, but not with this same attitude that we try to, run a marathon or climb the corporate ladder or something like that, because we understand that the practices don't produce the goal any more than a path to a mountain produces the mountain. So, there are some people out there teaching what they call Tantric Hatha Yoga. Most people pronounce it Hatha Yoga, right? It's Hatha Yoga. And this is not possible unless you, of course, choose that you're gonna teach and cultivate one attitude or the other, because they're opposing, right? Now, in other ways, it might be possible, and a lot of people are just using that phrase to mean modern postural yoga with a tantric flavor, which of course is perfectly possible and perfectly legitimate if the person knows what they're doing. Okay, the attitude to practice is hugely important, and it's much more important than what practices you do. So what the tantric tradition says is just this: make sure your practices cover all three domains of practice, meaning make sure you're practicing in all three of the main possible ways to practice. If you only practice in one of these ways, you're disadvantaging yourself enormously. So these three ways, these three upāyas taught by the tantric tradition, specifically non-dual Shaiva Tantra, we could summarize as being the ways of body, mind, and spirit. And I use those terms because everyone knows those terms. Everyone can understand the complementarity of those terms, body, mind, and spirit, but they are overly reductionistic for what the tradition is actually talking about. Because when we talk about the upāya, the method utilizing the body, for example, it's not just the physical body, it's also the so-called energy body or psychic body or subtle body or mental emotional body. These all being terms for the same phenomenon, if we can call it a phenomenon. So these practices of the body and energy body, which also include the faculty of the imagination. So you would think that goes in the mind category, except that when you're doing practices of the energy body, you're utilizing the imagination to visualize structures of the energy body, that as you practice more and more, you begin to get access to a very real, visceral experience of the energy body or mental emotional body. So there's an important principle here in the tradition that the West really doesn't generally understand. In fact, there's a profound misunderstanding, right? Because people, especially Western practitioners, will often ask, oh, I had this experience. Is it real or did I just make it up? Did I just imagine it? And this dichotomy, the tradition argues, doesn't really exist because consciousness is the source of all experience. So there is a valid question, of course, which is that, you know, did you have an experience that demonstrates an actual breakthrough on the path, or was it just wishful thinking on your part? Sure, that's a valid question. But this stark contrast that Westerners make between imagination and reality is not a real contrast. There is a spectrum there, absolutely, but not a hard boundary. So in other words, the tradition is saying that by imagining something, you can then start to access the underlying reality, right? So I'll give another example through what the tradition calls deity yoga, right? Through imagining yourself as the deity and having the qualities and attributes of the deity and having the energy body of the deity, you can start to actually experience your innate divinity. So something that starts in imagination can end up giving you access to that which is fundamentally real and continues to be real even if you were to stop believing in it. So in other words, all aspects of our human nature can be a key, can be a tool to going deeper in spiritual practice. Okay, so this first method, this upāya of the body, but also includes the energy body, also includes imagination, includes breathing exercises, all sorts of yogic practices, okay? That's one bucket, as it were, to when we're sorting practices, one of the three buckets that the tradition offers, okay? And then the second one is the method of mind, and this method has to do with refining your understanding, okay? So you have a particular idea or a whole host of ideas about the nature of reality. And in this method, you are refining those understandings and refining them and refining them until they become closer and closer and closer to reality itself. That is to say, your understanding becomes more and more and more, as it were, transparent, less of a veil and more of a window, we could say, until finally conceptual understanding is not needed at all. Conceptual understanding can then fall away at the terminus of the process of this second method, because you're simply intimately communing with reality itself, which is fundamentally unknowable to the mind. So in other words, if you were to remain with the most refined possible conceptual understanding of reality, it would still constitute an extremely subtle veil to the deeper experience of reality itself, which is always ineffable, wordless, and unknowable to our conceptual faculties. And yet we approach it through the refining of concepts. What does this mean in practice? This means, for example, marinating in spiritual teachings, letting spiritual teachings reorganize the way you think about reality, working with your concepts and your constructs until they become more malleable, more fluid, more flexible, because reality is that way. So if your concepts are rigid, they are not adequately aligned with reality. And if they're fluid, they're more adequately aligned with reality. So I could do the whole rest of the talk just on this method, because it's one that people might think they understand at first, but then they see, oh, no, this is much more subtle than I thought. But essentially, it's this process of refining understanding, refining your conceptualization of the nature of reality until it's transparent and then even no longer needed. Okay, so the first method and the second method can work together, because in the first method, you're, for example, working with the energy body, discovering, for example, blockages, or what we call blockages in the energy body, unresolved experiences. And as we release those or dissolve those or get those moving instead of stuck, then that opens us to potentially deeper insight, more refined understanding. Okay. So that's just an example of how one method can actually feed the other, and it works even without you knowing that it can work that way. So then the third method, the method of spirit, right? This is the hardest to explain because it is a non-conceptual method. But there is a simple way to explain it. It's just that actualizing it is, for many people, very, very difficult because their concepts are always getting in the way. But this third non-conceptual method, the method of pure spirit, we could say, has to do with cultivating intimacy with your experience, aside from your conceptualization of it. So you see, this is not a contradiction, because even though you're still practicing at times refining conceptual understanding in that second method, okay, you're also taking a break from that and from the first method to simply go as deep into direct experience as you can. And of course, the first two methods can feed the third. So what does it mean to go deeper into direct experience? It just setting aside your concepts of what is and becoming as intimate as you can with what is. Now, if you haven't done a lot of spiritual practice in the first and second method, then this third method will not be so available to you. You might think it's available, and it's yet still not. So, for example, in this third method, you go into the sensual world. You explore the sensual world. You become intimate with the sensual world and the physical body. But when you go to do this, your body image constitutes a kind of barrier to intimacy with the direct experience of body. And luckily, the first and second method are going to help you shed body image, right? Your mental conception of your body with all the associations that has. And in the same way, in this third method, you could just, go out and lie in the grass and caress some leaves and hug a tree. And that can be beautiful. But for most people, what's happening is there's still this concept imposing itself. The concept of me, a person, a practitioner, doing a thing, in this case, hugging a tree as object, tree as something separate, And but for anyone, that could conceivably fall away for at least a moment, right? They could be hugging the tree and feeling the bark on their cheek, and all at once cease to be a person doing a thing, a subject perceiving an object. And for a moment, there can be just pure experience, just that texture of the bark, the particular sensation of bark meeting skin, where you can't tell where one ends and the other begins, and you don't even have the concept of bark or skin anymore. It's pure sensation, it's pure experience. Okay. So even though this third most subtle of all methods is relatively inaccessible for most people, still it's helpful to just give it a try, to work with it in one way or another. And then the first and second method will make the third sort of come online more and more fully, more and more successfully, we could say. So a simple way to practice that third method is to simply ask the question, what is the quality of this moment before I have a thought about it? But you have to kind of set up the conditions for that question to work. You have to first kind of prime your mind. We're not going to accept an answer in words. We won't accept an answer in words to this question, mind. And you prime yourself by understanding that the question itself isn't about getting an answer. It's about opening to another mode of perceiving. So the question again is, what is the quality of this moment before I have a thought about it? Before I have an interpretation of it? And if framing it as a question doesn't work, you don't need to necessarily. You're just looking into experience and investigating, becoming curious about the quality of experience prior to the imposition of thought and interpretation, even if that window for you is only 1 second, as it is for most people. Look into experience and you might have a communion that you couldn't possibly put into words that lasts 1, 2, 3 seconds, and then there comes the mind to say, oh, that's peaceful, or that's immediate, or that's vivid, or that's whatever, you know. And as soon as the mind comes in and puts its label, you just take a breath and begin again with the practice, because now the quality of each moment is subtly different. So even 10 seconds later, you ask again, what is the quality of this moment before I have a thought about it? And there's going to be a different answer. Not answer, but experience, right? So that's one way of talking about this very, very subtle third method. And different branches of the tradition specialize more in one method or the other. And we see whole traditions that almost exclusively embrace one method. So there are branches of Zen Buddhism, for example, that are almost entirely trying to teach that third method, which is almost unteachable, but that's what they focus on, right? And then there are other traditions like Vedanta that almost entirely focus on that second method, right? Contemplation and refining of understanding. And other traditions, other yogic traditions that almost entirely focus on that first method. And so the Tantric tradition says, no, you need to actually explore in all these dimensions and keep moving amongst these 3 dimensions of practice and letting them reinforce each other and going deeper with them in various ways. Now, is there a meta principle that would make your practices in all 3 methods more effective? And the answer is yes. There is a meta principle that makes practice in any of these methods more effective. And that has to do with motivation. Where are you coming from? Why are you doing what you're doing? So people have various answers, to this. And oftentimes when they try to address their motive for practice, people will just give the sort of rote answer, the answer that they've heard others give, that they've learned they're supposed to give. Oh, yes, I'm practicing for awakening or enlightenment or for the benefit of all beings, or transcend ordinary human experience, whatever they think the motive should be. But really, they're addressing the goal. And the real question here is, where are you coming from in doing the practice? So what we find when we investigate this is that most people are practicing with a motive that is almost guaranteed to be ineffective. So, for example, they might be practicing with the understanding or belief that there's something wrong with them as they are, and maybe spiritual practice will fix it. Maybe spiritual practice will fix this wrongness that I perceive in me. Something's off, something's wrong, or something's incomplete. That's another version of the same thing. I'm missing something. There's a missing piece, and I've got to find that missing piece, and I'm looking here and there to find the missing piece because I'm inadequate as I am. I am incomplete as I am. So this is practicing on the basis of the belief in the broken self and hoping spiritual practice will repair this allegedly broken self. And this motive is ineffective because it rests on a false premise, that of the broken self. So the antidote is that sooner or later, we get some sort of a intuition. We might hear a teaching about it, or we might get a direct intuition that what we are, our true nature, is in fact always already essentially whole. That what we are is not broken, right? That though we can identify alleged problems or issues in the psyche or in the body, what we fundamentally are, that which makes all experience possible, is whole and complete in and of itself and couldn't be otherwise. And all we need is a glimpse of that, even the tiniest glimpse. And then we can start practicing on the basis of that intuitive glimpse. Meaning to say, you can practice with the attitude, I know that what I am is intrinsically whole. I glimpsed it. And I'm practicing to fully realize that truth, to fully uncover it, to fully embody it, to know it without beyond a shadow of a doubt. And this becomes a much more powerful motive for practice than that false belief. There's something wrong with me as I am, or something missing, and spiritual practice will fix it or provide the missing piece. So practice that rests on a falsehood cannot be very effective. And yet, by some miracle, it can be effective enough to give us that glimpse that we need to then develop this motive, this reason for practice, where we're coming from that intuitive sense, even if we can't access it in any given moment, but we've had an intuitive sense of our intrinsic wholeness, completeness, and perhaps even perfection. So that's the first of the three elements of motive that the tradition addresses. The second is that many people practice for the sake of pleasure or power. These are lumped together in the same category. The second impure motive, as it's called, pleasure or power. Now, what does this mean in our terms? Many people practice for the sake of peak experiences. They want juicy experiences, exciting experiences, spiritual revelations. They want dramatic experiences. They want things they can put in their spiritual autobiography. So this almost fetishization of experience, as if the goal of the spiritual life is to collect as many peak experiences as possible, which Tantric teacher Chogyam Trungpa called spiritual materialism, right? Like people collect trophies and put them on their mantle. Some people collect experiences. And they believe that the number of dramatic or amazing experiences they've had demonstrates how spiritually advanced they are. And the tradition says, no, actually, this is just delusion. Experience by its very nature is ephemeral, right? It's impermanent. There's nothing to hang on to. It will always come and go. No experience can become permanent. And more importantly, we don't experience fulfillment through the aggregation of peak experiences. It's not a cumulative thing. And we don't realize this because in our in the world, in the society we've created for ourselves, so many things are cumulative. You accumulate money, and then you have more resources. You might pass a tipping point where you have as much resources as you need, and you're like, great, okay. So then you imagine it might be the same with spiritual practice, and it's not. So the way the tradition says it is, you'll never accumulate so much sukha that you experience ananda as your default state. Sukha means happiness or pleasure. You'll never have so many pleasurable or happy experiences that then you kind of pass a tipping point, and bliss or joy or contentment or love becomes your default state, ananda. It says, doesn't work like that. In fact, ananda is part of your intrinsic nature. It needs to be accessed, it needs to be uncovered, it needs to be explored and embodied. It's already there, and it doesn't result from any kind of accumulation. So this is hugely important to realize, right? And of course, there's also those people who practice for the sake of power, which is a particular form of pleasure, right? They are perhaps the minority, but still, we see lots of people who practice because they want to have more charisma. They want to win friends and influence people. They want to be like a guru figure. They want to have siddhi, or they want, this sort of thing. This is also, of course, impure motive. And by impure, the tradition means ineffective. It's not going to work to produce the goal of the spiritual path. It can't, because it's founded again on a fundamental misunderstanding, which is that I could accumulate enough pleasure or power to then be fulfilled. And if we look at the history of the world, luckily for us, we have so much evidence that this is false. So many people who accumulated boundless pleasure and power and were not fulfilled by it. They just always wanted more. And yet somehow many of us fail to apply the examples of history to ourselves. We see those examples, but we still think, if I could just have a little more, then I would be fulfilled. A little more, whatever, followers on Instagram, a little more money, a little more influence, a little more, that doubt persists, right? So it's important to antidote these misunderstandings. And the tradition says only communion with the truth is deeply fulfilling and reveals your innate capacity for bliss or joy or love, all translations of ananda. So therefore, you antidote the longing for pleasure or power with the longing for truth. And now this can only be done authentically when you realize that nothing will ever satisfy you except to truly know that which is, to know the truth in its depth, to know it viscerally, to know it directly, right? So this is not a teaching on fake it till you make it. It doesn't mean that you should sort of pretend to have the motivation of wanting to know the truth, when in fact you still have the motivation of wanting more wonderful experiences. But the tradition advises we can at least pray for pure motive. May I practice out of a desire to know the truth? May I? Acknowledging the reality that it's not yet happening, but it could, right? And when that shift takes place, it makes a radical difference to all your practices. Okay, so that's the third. Sorry, that's the second issue that's addressed in this under this rubric of motive, and the third has to do with this issue some people identify as like, oh, isn't spiritual practice selfish? You're just doing it for you. Yeah, it can be. So spiritual practice that is for the self is primarily problematic because it reinforces the idea of a separate self. Okay. So this is not, the issue is not about being selfish as the term is commonly understood, because in fact, you deserve all the happiness, all the joy, all the freedom in this universe, right? This is not, there's the concept of deserving is a human-made socio-cultural concept that's not applicable. What you are is in fact the source of all value. So if you realize what you are, you will realize that you literally deserve, you know, all possible joy or freedom or whatever quality of your essential nature you care to name. Okay. So we're not concerned with that particular aspect of what we call selfishness. We're concerned with the fact that if you are holding on to the notion of yourself as on a journey, you're on your unique journey of spirituality, and you might become enlightened, you might become liberated, right? That attitude works at cross purposes to the practice itself. It disables the practice or undermines it because, in fact, there is no separate self. And it feels as if there is, of course, let's acknowledge that. It feels as if there's a separate self. And that separate self that seems to be real is not ever going to attain enlightenment, right? Because in this process, that separate self dissolves. As one of my teachers says, it dies away into what you actually are. What you think you are, the separate self, dies away into what you actually are. And then the intrinsic, already existing awakeness is revealed. So there's no self that attains awakeness, you see. And so there's no self-concept left to claim awakeness. I did it. I'm finally enlightened. No, because that sense of the separate self has dissolved. There's no one, as it were, to claim that shift, right? Because nothing is owned, nothing is possessed. That's a mental construct that exists in relation to another mental construct, that of a separate self. Okay, so so the antidote to that problem is to practice for the benefit of all beings. And this doesn't mean selflessly, as the cliche understanding goes, oh, I'm not practicing for me, I'm practicing for everyone else. No, the benefit of all beings is all beings, all being manifest as organisms. And that, of course, includes the body you habitually call yours, right? The organism you habitually call me, right? That includes that. In fact, practice, when it works, generates blessing energy that moves out from you to bless all beings. So it blesses the organism in which the blessing energy is generated first, and then moves out to benefit all beings. Okay. So I'm gonna summarize here, because there are these three aspects of pure motive that antidote the three impure motives. And notice the language I just used. We could say there's three impure motives, but the antidotes actually cohere into a single pure motive. And again, don't get hung up on the word pure. It really means effective, right? That motive which will work for your practice. So remember, practicing out of a sense of your inherent wholeness rather than a sense of your brokenness or wrongness, that's the first element, okay? And the one way to summarize it is, you could say, instead of the belief there's something wrong with me as I am and I hope the practice will fix it, it's the conviction there's something right with me as I am and I hope the practice will reveal it. That's just a way to kind of summarize the difference there. So it's a process of uncovering, revealing what's already there, instead of believing wrongly that there's something that needs to be obtained or added that's not already here. Okay, so that's that first element. And then the second one, right, was cultivating the realization that you'll never accumulate your way to fulfillment, whether through pleasure or power, and that only communion with the deepest nature of reality, which we call the truth, can fulfill. So you develop a longing for the truth. And thirdly, antidoting that sense of a separate self on its individual journey of spirituality, antidoting that wrong understanding with the understanding that all beingness is striving to wake up to itself in every possible form, and that by engaging in this process, you're generating blessing energy for the benefit of all, and that it's not actually something you are doing, but rather something that you're opening to. The spiritual process is not something you are doing. You're not the agent responsible for spiritual progress. You're responsible for showing up consistently so that the natural process can unfold itself. So it's more like the whole universe is doing it rather than you. So in summary, then, the concise version of the pure motive is, may I practice out of love for myself, out of a desire to know the truth, and for the benefit of all beings. Okay, so just to go back to that first element for a moment, because you see that wrong understanding that we addressed earlier of the broken self, that is a form of self-hatred. So when you're practicing with a conviction that there's something wrong with you as you are unknowingly practicing on the basis of self-hatred. And that's why love is the antidote. But language is important here. It needs to be phrased in a way that works for you. So what I'm not prescribing is, oh, repeat these words, everyone, just like this. So practicing out of love for myself could also be practicing out of a sense of the inherent wholeness that I am. Takes a few more words to say, but for someone for whom myself, that word myself, might reinforce that sense of separate identity, then we don't want that word. We want some other way of saying it, you know? So practicing out of a sense of my inherent wholeness or the inherent wholeness that I am, something like that. And out of a desire to know the truth, right? May I practice out of a desire to know the truth, right? May I develop fully this understanding that it is truth, not positive experiences, that brings about this kind of fulfillment, which is not dependent on external circumstances. So no accumulation of positive experiences could ever bring that about. And that's important to realize. And you may not realize it yet, but you'll continue to go deeper into this possibility, and the longing for the truth matures. It just matures in the practitioner of its own accord once they orient to that possibility. Right? And third, letting go of the story of being on my unique spiritual journey that's all about me. And as one of my teachers says, getting over yourself, finally just getting over yourself and practicing for the benefit of all beings, because it's the most natural thing to do once you understand the possibilities inherent in human life. Okay? So I've gone through the three elements over and over, using slightly different words each time. And that is a traditional pedagogical method, meaning to say, just going over the same teaching many times, using a little bit different words each time to help it go deeper, 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 right? Because it's not a matter of memorizing the teaching and repeating the right words. It's a matter of understanding it well enough that you could write your own version of the pure motive. You understand what's being antidoted, the three wrong understandings or impure motives that are being antidoted, and so you can develop, your own way of saying this potentially. But again, a nice default is, may I practice out of love for myself or out of a sense of inherent wholeness in my being, out of a desire to know the truth and for the benefit of all. So if you repeat that prayer every time you practice, every time you sit for meditation, every time you do an asana practice, every time you do any spiritual practice whatsoever, from contemplation to inquiry to meditation to awareness cultivation to scriptural study, all of it, anything, remember the pure motive before you practice, and at least pray for the pure motive in a way that makes sense to you. And this is what comes closest to the idea of a magic bullet, something that invariably works, meaning to say it increases the effectiveness of all the spiritual practices when it is applied as a meta principle. Okay, so it's a really, really beautiful teaching. It's a really, really valuable tool. So what I've tried to do here in this talk is present that which is essential, indispensable for practice on the spiritual path according to the Tantric tradition. Practicing in these three methods, remember, body, mind, and spirit, understanding those terms are not adequate in and of themselves, but practicing in all those three methods of body, mind, and spirit with the pure motive as much as possible, or at least praying for the pure motive, at least orienting towards it, right? Now, let's say you find you do a self-investigation, a self-inquiry, and you discover, oh my gosh, I have all the impure motives. Of course, everyone does until they don't. Please don't imagine there's anyone on earth who just magically has the pure motive. Everyone practices for one of these three so-called impure motives or ineffective motives until they don't. So if you see that in yourself, it's a very good sign, not a bad sign. And the reason it's a good sign is because you have the power of self-reflection, which is so crucial on the path. If you self-reflect and find the impure motives in yourself, then we know you're good. You're good to go. This is going to work because self-reflection is this such a powerful ally on the path, and without it, it's unlikely to have this realization or awakening, right? So if you find that, oh, I just can't seem to practice for any other reason, then I think there's something wrong with me, or I want more pleasurable experience, or I want myself to attain the spiritual goal, then if you feel helpless in the face of those conditioned motivations, that very helplessness can be turned into an ally. When you feel helpless, you let yourself be brought to your knees in humility, in surrender. And you realize, the separate self, can't do this. And that's right. That is correct. It can't. So if you find yourself in this state of feeling helpless, I don't have the pure motive, I can't seem to get it, turn that into an asset on the path. Let that helplessness humble you, open you, and you may find that when you create enough openness, then a mysterious power that we only can call grace starts to rush in with space the vacuum is filled, nature abhors a vacuum, right? And the grace starts to rush in to fill. And that insight that you need to have, the insight into your inherent wholeness, arises through grace. Grace means we can't explain why it happens then and not some other time. You know, it's mysterious. And it feels like grace in the sense that it's like feels like a blessed gift, you know. So on the tantric path, we turn every apparent disadvantage into an advantage. So when you feel like, oh, I'm not good at this, I can't do this, whatever, that helplessness opens you to surrender, opens you to grace. There is no such thing as a disadvantage on the path, only a perceived disadvantage. So we say in the tantric tradition, the circumstances of your life are perfect for your awakening. And the circumstances of your life include whatever's coming along with this organism, what you're calling the psychological baggage, what you're calling the trauma or woundedness. All of that is actually perfect for setting you up for awakening, right? It is the perfect setup. When consciousness goes to awaken to what it is, when it becomes ready to realize its true nature, at that moment of readiness, the conditions are already perfect for that process of realization, right? So the apparent obstacles are the exact challenges you need on your spiritual path, right? The apparent traumas give you the opportunities for resolution, integration, and breakthrough that you need on your spiritual path. The people in your life who are so difficult and cause you so much trouble, and I could surely do better on the path without them. No, they provide the perfect circumstances for your awakening, your realization, your liberation. So there's very little on the path that you are advised to take on faith, and this is one of those things. If you just have faith that the circumstances of your life are perfect for your awakening at every moment, at every stage of the process, not just at the beginning, then that faith eventually, you know, doesn't need to be faith anymore because it's proven to be true. Okay, so that's my summary of some important teachings on the path. And as always, I want to offer blessings of gratitude and love to the great saints, sages, siddhas, yoginis, wisdom masters, gurus and teachers of all times and spaces, and especially of the lineages that gave us these specific teachings. And may we all continue to receive the blessings that flow from those who walked before us on the path and embody those and share those with others. Om.
So yeah, I loved what you said about how even without pure motive, the practices work anyways. They work enough to get you, to the point where you're then contemplating pure motive. And that just
Exactly.
it felt like such a blessing because it's not like we have to have it's just as you said, everything's perfect in each moment. But one thing I was thinking about in my own process that seemed important was the aspect of avoiding discomfort. And for me, orienting towards the truth and feeling like the truth is more important than anything else helped me go into some uncomfortable places. And I wondered which one that fell into and where that was at from the tradition's perspective.
That's Thank you for asking that. That's absolutely crucial. You know, in this compressed presentation, I didn't touch on that, but perhaps I really should have because it's so important. That's in that second part, that second element of pure motive, it's also in there because, as you said, when your goal is pleasure, when your goal is peak experiences, or when your goal is power, then you are unconsciously or even consciously avoiding the uncomfortable, challenging, confronting aspects of the spiritual path and the process, you know. Whereas when your goal is truth, you realize you need to go through uncomfortable moments, uncomfortable realizations, awkwardness, even profound rawness, to as part of that journey. And it's interesting actually, because what I found in my own process is I orient towards truth, and all that matters is truth. Okay, so there's some discomfort in asking myself the hard questions, and doing that self-inquiry and all that. And then a lot of discomfort. And then I move through that with this burning desire for truth. And then there's some kind of a breakthrough with bliss coming, all this bliss, this joy, like, um, and then it's very natural for the mind or the body mind to start to go, oh yes, more of that, please. And the way I started to think of it is it's maybe an unfortunate metaphor, but it's the one I used. It's like the crosshairs, if you're doing target practice, the crosshairs of your gun or your bow and arrow, whatever you're using, it's like they drift. They drift away from the real target, which is truth, and towards more bliss. And I over and over had to keep doing the thing of bringing it back because it drifted. Oh, more bliss. Oh, but then as soon as the goal became more bliss, the process didn't work in the same way. It slowed down, or something else happened, and I had to come back to truth. And so, with realization, bliss comes along for the ride, but we have to be vigilant about not then changing that fundamental orientation, and being willing to. In fact, the most awake people I know who are like living bodhisattvas, they still say there might be more discomfort for me to go through. There might be more. I don't know. I'm open to that. So they never stop being open to that, even though they're living in this state of like apparently total freedom, you know, and have access to virtually limitless joy, but they haven't fixated on that. And anyone who does fixate on that, that state does not become their default state, you know? So there's got to be this openness to, at any moment, there might be something profoundly uncomfortable to move through, and I will give myself to that because I care more about truth. Truth is what is. I want intimacy with what is. And if you want it at any price, as it were, then we could say liberation is guaranteed or virtually guaranteed. Yeah, thanks for bringing that up.
I have a follow-up question then on truth. And I've heard you talk a lot about truth, but just for people who might be coming in on this summit and might have their own ideas. Well, my truth is, what I experience. I wonder if you could speak to just this piece on truth a little bit and what you mean by truth.
Yeah. Yeah. Truth is not your story. It's not your interpretation. It's not your opinion. It's a non-conceptual communion with what it is. So, for example, and also still tying in Shiva's question here, let's say you sense somewhere in your body there's a constriction, a tightening, a holding. And you go into that. You're curious about that because you're interested in truth. What is this? What is this constriction? And you direct awareness into this tightness or holding in the body. Then you might, as you go into it, discover some emotion that's locked up in that phenomenon that you're experiencing somatically. You might experience deep grief that seems to, be ancient or go way back, or you might experience this rage or something else, or you might experience this apparent emptiness, which can be scary, or something else, right? And so then the mind wants to make a story about it. Why is this grief here? Why is this rage here? Why am I experiencing emptiness inside? I thought I was supposed to experience fullness or light. The mind makes its story, and then there's the opportunity to simply set it aside. Say, I don't need a label for this. I don't need to know where this came from. In fact, it's probably impossible to know. You can't fix a kind of historical origin point for these unresolved energies in the body. So I don't need to have that mental idea or label even. In fact, if I even strip off the label of sadness or rage and go deeper into it, what is this like to experience this if I no longer evaluate it as negative or a problem, then more of it opens up and it becomes this even transformative power, So that's the thing is that when we're talking about truth with a capital T, we always mean, not just me, anyone in any spiritual tradition, right? If they know what they're talking about, truth with a capital T is always non-conceptual truth. It can't be said in words, so it's not a dogma, it's not an opinion, it's not an interpretation. It's communion with what is, which is always indescribable, right? So yeah, that's really important that in the Tantric tradition, we say thoughts are tools, not truths. So thoughts can't be truth, but they can be tools. We can use them to help orient us to truth, point us to, invite us into truth. In fact, that's what this whole talk was, Yeah, thank you.
I have another one about the upayas. Um, I just started thinking, you said Zen focuses on the Shambhava upaya and Vedanta,
Some branches of Zen, yeah.
some branches. And certainly those traditions, Zen and Vedanta, also produce awakened beings. And so, or maybe, I don't know, we'll hear what you say about that. But I'm wondering, like, if Tantra says to like focus on these three in equal measure, or if there's like a point at which a person might focus on one entirely more, or if they should all be, yeah, I'm just wondering if there's any more.
Yeah, no, that's a good question. That's a good question. Yeah, because it's not to say, oh, those other paths can't work because they focus too much on one or the other. In fact, Abhinavagupta's view, at least, let's not say the whole tradition because there's too much variation of view. But in the view of Abhinavagupta, right, that you can, if that Shambhava, that third method of pure spirit or intuition or non-conceptual practice, if that works for you, that could be all you need. But it's very rare, very rare that somebody can work so deeply in that method. So it needs to be supplanted with that second method of refining understanding. And that usually needs to be supplanted or not supplanted, supported, supported by the first method of working with the body, right? And opening up the body and the experience of energy in the body as well. But no, like he does clearly say that it could be possible that you don't need all three, but that for most people we should look at that. Am I working in all these three ways? And it can also be that one collapses into the next and collapses into the next. You're doing a body-based practice, and suddenly it gives you a deeper insight, right? A refined understanding, which need not be verbally articulated or anything. And then that refined insight might then collapse into direct non-conceptual experience. And so at any moment that can happen, right? But then it's often the case that whatever was experienced in that deeper state of non-conceptual communion, the person feels like, oh, I lost it again. Now what do I do? Go back to what you can do, that first method and the second method. And it's not that you're actually going backwards, because everything is happening in the same field, right? It's just the mind's, if the mind categorizes these as increasingly advanced methods, then you imagine, oh, now I have to go back to, working with but that's not correct at all, because it's just the mind making that hierarchy, when in fact it's a fluid reality all arising within the same field.
Hope you enjoyed the episode. Remember, you can always find out more about the tradition of non-dual Shaiva Tantra at tantrailluminated.org, where, if you wish, you can become a subscriber to our online learning portal, and you'll receive access to a vast number of recordings, including a comprehensive curriculum in Tantric philosophy, Tantric yoga practices, guided meditations, and much more. Music for the podcast composed and recorded by Ann Leader. Find her at annleader.com. Podcast produced by Paula Chamas. New episodes drop every other week. And may all beings benefit.